purpose of today's interview is twofold. One is to explore the biographical, family, and intellectual development of Rabbi David Lapin. And the main question that we're going to be asking today, how are we learning Hashem's Torah from Rabbi David Lapin? It's a long-form, in-depth interview. Welcome, Rabbi Lapin. Really appreciate the time. Really appreciate the Torah. It's incredibly enriching for myself and my family. And the first question is, who are you? Or better yet, who do you want your children and grandchildren to describe you when you're long dead? More precisely, how do you want your Talmudim to describe you 40 years from now?
Wow, how do I see myself? What is my identity? What is my legacy? What a big question, and one that I haven't really stopped to articulate. So thank you, Benjamin, for the opportunity, not only to share it with all of you, but to allow me the opportunity to think on that and actually articulate it. One of the things that's always troubled me about my life is, if I think about my contemporaries in the Torah world, most of them, many of them, have been fortunate enough to be spending 24 hours a day in Torah all of their lives. And I spend a portion of my day in Torah and have done all of my life. Many of my contemporaries in the business and professional world spend all of their day in business and in their professions. How am I to compete with people who in Torah spend all their time in Torah and in business spend all their time in business? And it's not about competing in terms of winning. It's just about being better than mediocre. It's just about excelling, because excellence is something that is so important to me in everything that we do. How can I achieve any level of excellence when the two areas in which I am involved and focused each require a full-time involvement, and my involvement isn't full-time? And I've had to answer that for myself in the sense that my real focus, if I were to say, what is the single focus? Is it Torah? Is it the professions? It's really the concept of achdut, of echad, the concept of integration. The fact that I don't see my learning and my professional lives as a bifurcated existence of two different worlds. To me, there is such an integration. And I think that's what I want to be known for. And I think that's what differentiates me to some degree from many other people, in that I have tried all my life to find and live that integration of a complete life, so that when one says the bracha in the morning of la'asok b'divrei Torah and Asher b'chabani, we said the brachot, we said the blessings for Torah learning. It's brought in the halacha that we don't have to repeat the bracha later on during the day. If I say the bracha when I start preparing the Matmonim at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then at 10 or 11 o'clock I'm working with a client, when I get back to learning again at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, do I need to make the bracha again? I don't need to, because halakha sees the integration. There's no reason for me to have stopped learning even while I was involved in working, that one's mind is operating in that realm. So I've tried to create that integration, and I think that's what I try to bring in the Matmonim and in all my Torah teaching over the last nearly 70 years, because I've been teaching since I was 10 years old. And in all of my teaching, I think that's what I try to bring, to be able to see the world, life, contemporary life, relevant life through the lens of Torah. Torah, apart from being something in its own right that is completely self-encompassing and all-encompassing, is also a lens through which to see the world and live life. And it's that integration that I try to bring to my life, to that of my family, and to all of you.
When you said integration, can you talk about who you're named after? Let's start from the very beginning, right? Like, we're going to go through your parents, family background, but who are you? Right. First of all, what's your name? What's your full name?
That's good. My name is David Lapin. My English name was Beryl, which is the Yiddish for Dov. Dov was my paternal grandfather, and David was my maternal grandfather. They both passed away not long before I was born. So I never knew them, but do carry their names, both of their names. My father, Rabbi Chaim Lapin, was a very well-known Rav and Dayan in South Africa for most of his life. And then he went to the United States and founded Kehilas Am Echad, the community in San Jose, California, which he led until his death. So I was born into a rabbinic home, into a home where that was Torah and Rabbonis all the time. It was rabbinics and it was Torah. My mother came from family. Her family name was Thal, and they were actually a farming family. They all came from Eastern Europe. They all came from Lithuanian and Polish areas, and came to South Africa at the time that all those Jews did come to South Africa, the beginning of the 20th century. My paternal grandfather was a businessman. He was involved in the ostrich feather trade and later on in the wool trade. And my maternal grandfather was a farmer. And so they were both, Balabatim, they were both in business. And my grandfather's brother was Rabbi Lapin, the great Baal Musar of our generation, the great tzaddik of our generation. So in my earlier background, I already had these two worlds of a business background and a background of strictly Torah. Even closer to home, my father was a Rav. He learnt in Telz in Lithuania. He learnt in London in Eitz Chaim with his uncle, Rabbi Lapin. So he was immersed completely in Torah, although he had a very wide general knowledge and interest in things general, quite apart from his Torah, but his training was in Torah. And my uncle, his brother, was a businessman in South Africa. So there was always these two areas, and I never saw them as conflicting, even as a child growing up. And even when I took it for granted that I was certainly going to go to yeshiva because I wanted to, and I loved learning Torah, and I wanted to get good at learning Torah. So I knew I was going to spend a lot of time in yeshiva and in Israel. Later on, I spent a little bit of time in England as well in yeshiva. I knew that was going to be the case, but I also was pretty sure, even growing up, that I was not going to want to earn my living in Torah. I had seen how my father, the sacrifices he made to remain absolutely intellectually honest. I saw what it took from him never to compromise, even though he was indebted to Balabatim, to people who, committees and shuls and the people that operated that. He was always his own person and operated strictly according to halakha, according to Jewish law. And I'd always felt I wasn't sure that I had that strength of character to be able to do that, to be able to be paid by people who would have no sway over my thinking or teaching. And I really wanted intellectual independence. I really wanted to know that I could learn what I wanted and I could teach in the way I wanted, and that no matter what the prevailing trends were and what the kind of political correctness of the time is, I would be free to teach truth. That was what was really important to me, that people who learn from me would be accessing a level of MS, at least through the lens that I had been taught, seeing the world truthfully through the lens of my rabbeim, of my teachers. And for that, I felt I needed an independent source of income. So I had planned initially to go to law school, perhaps practice as a lawyer. Things didn't turn out that way, and I got an opportunity to get into business, and I was trained in international commodity trading, which I did for a period of time, then started my own business, and later on, some 30 years ago, started a consulting business, because I found the time that I was in business, it was great. It was allowing me to learn, it was supporting me, it was giving me independence. But at the end of the day, I was buying and selling things. It wasn't really, my mind wasn't working in the Torah sense. And I thought, is there a possibility of creating a business where even when I'm in business, what I'm doing is Torah, is teaching, is bringing truth to the world? And that's when I started the consulting company, which is known today as Lapin International, where it's exactly that. It's teaching values, teaching a sense of purpose, teaching that which is divine in business and for business, to try and elevate the activity of business, elevate the lives of business people and people who work in the business and professional arena, giving them some sense of kedushat hachayim, of the sanctity of life and the sanctity of work and the sanctity of serving God in everything that one does. And thankfully, for the last 30 years or so, I've been able to earn my living doing something that is so purposeful, again, in my life, of integrating the general world with the world of Torah.
Back to your name for a second. You said your name is Dov David. Why aren't you Rabbi Dov Lapin? I've never heard Dov before. I've listened to shiurim for a year now. Never once Dov. What happened to Dov?
So my parents seem to have made an arrangement in talking about my name and why I'm known as David Lapin and not Dov Lapin. And that was that I would be named after both grandparents. The first name would be my paternal grandfather, the second name my maternal grandfather, but I would be known by the second name to compromise for the fact that it was second. So each one got a first. So I've always been known as David and Rabbi David Lapin in the rabbinic world, and somehow the Dov has never really been used other than...
I think your name influences who you are at all? Like,
it definitely does. As a child, I loved bears. I loved bears, not just teddy bears. I loved the animal. So definitely an affinity to that combination of strength and warmth. I think that a bear connotates. I don't know that they really are such warm animals. I wouldn't like to get into intimate connection with any bear, but certainly they have that kind of image and idea of a teddy bear. So that idea of something that's huggable and yet strong is something that appeals to me. And of course, with David, I've always felt such deep pride in the meaning of that word, the idea of beloved to God, that feeling that being loved by God and loving God. And of course, David HaMelech, just my hero in Tanakh, just somebody that I love and admire so much. And I'm sure that a lot of that is to do with
what was your nickname as a kid, Rob, in South Africa? What did they call you?
I was always
Davy?
No, never Davy. I've got one client that calls me Dave. I've tried for 2 decades to get him off it because I really don't like it.
Okay.
So I've always been David.
If someone sees you on the street, or meets you somewhere, what would you like them to call you? Rabbi Lapin?
So it's quite interesting, Benjamin, because I always introduce myself as David Lapin, almost always. In the professional world, I introduce myself that way. In the social world, I always introduce myself that way, unless it's a very formal situation where I'm there as a rabbi. But somehow people always switch to rabbi. Even my non-Jewish clients around the world, start talking to me about me as their rabbi. Even the just non-Jews and people of many different religions and cultures, and refer to me very quickly. It starts off as David, and very quickly it switches without anybody telling them to do so. And then I just leave it. Whatever people feel comfortable is fine with me.
When your mother was angry at you, what did she call you?
David.
David. Okay, there we go. Great. I have a quote here I want to read from Rav Yosheber Soloveitchik. What is Torah Imecha? What kind of a Torah does the mother pass on? Most of all, I learned that Judaism expresses itself not only in the formal compliance with the law, but also in the living experience. She taught me that there is a flavor, a scent, a warmth to the mitzvot. I learned from her the most important thing in life, to feel the presence of the Almighty and a gentle pressure of His hand resting upon my frail shoulders. Without her teachings, which quite often were transmitted to me in silence, I would have grown up soulless, being dry and insensitive. It's a quote from Rav Soloveitchik. You want to speak about your mother's Torah that she gave to you, a little bit of personality? I mean, what's her name also? Like, what's the,
It's such a beautiful quote from Rav Soloveitchik. My mother's name was Maras Malia Thal, Malia Lapin. She was known as Maisie, was her English name. And she didn't come from a family of B'nai Torah, of Talmidei Chachomim, and she didn't have the opportunity until she married my father, really to be deeply engaged in the world of Torah.
When Rob says that, like, what kind of school? She went to public school? I just don't know.
Yes, totally public school, lived out in the country, and then went to study, worked for the government in South Africa in the law department of the Department of Justice, and then married my father and became a full-time Rebbitzin and wife and mother.
How old was she when she met Rob? When they met and they got married?
Well, they met very young. They met at school, and then my father went off to yeshiva, was away, and in those days when you were away, you were away. There was no contact. There was no communication.
There was
nothing. There was absolutely nothing, which is so interesting. So he was away in yeshiva in England first, and then in Telz altogether for about 8 or 9 years, during which there was no contact.
Can Rob just give a year for this? Because you're saying Telz, that means before World War II.
Before World War II, correct.
Everyone was murdered.
Except those that got out. Reb Motel Gifted, the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz, was a close friend of his. Reb Motel, of course, got out and became Rosh Yeshiva in Cleveland. Other friends from overseas who got out, but otherwise
90+%.
They were wiped out. His Rosh Yeshiva and all the Rosh Yeshivas, except those that got to the United States, were wiped out. So he was in Telz until the breakout of the war. It must have been about 1940 when he left. He was in Lithuania when the Nazis conquered it. He got out actually after, so I don't remember exactly what year that was, but we can check up. And it was right after the Nazis had marched into Lithuania that Reb Motel Pagamansky, who he was very close to, met him on Shabbos and said to him, "What are you still doing here?" And my father said to Reb Motel, "Well, what are you still doing here?" And Reb Motel said, "I can't leave. You can. Get out." And my father said, "Okay, I'll go tomorrow." This was Shabbos. And Reb Motel said, "No, you'll go today. Don't waste any time. Get out. Even on Shabbos, you need to get out of Lithuania." So that was the time he left Lithuania, went through Switzerland, went back to London, and then got a ship to South Africa. When he landed at Cape Town, I'm told, my mother tells the story, she got it from people who were at Cape Town who knew my father. He got that. One of the first things he did when he got off the boat is he started asking whether anybody knew my mother, anybody had heard of her, anybody knew where she was.
So this is love. This is love.
This was real love. And he tracked her and found her.
How old were they at this point?
And they were not young. They must have been in their early 30s. Both not married, both had not gone out, had somehow known that this was going to happen, although there was no communication. And they had an incredibly loving relationship to the last day of my father's life.
Total?
4 children. I have 2 brothers and a sister.
Where's the Rav in the order?
I'm second. So I have an older brother who today lives in Baltimore. I have a sister who lives in Lakewood today. And I have a younger brother who's in California. Yeah, and that's how they met. So she didn't come from a religious background, but marrying my father, I think what I learned from her was Mesiras Nefesh, was real dedication and commitment to her husband and family, commitment to her role as Rebbitzin. She took that incredibly seriously. And if ever I have the image of a professional Rebbitzin, that was my mother. Every step that she took, every breath she breathed, she was conscious of that role, an inner role of supporting my father in the work that she admired so deeply, and also the public role, realizing that she was a public figure, that people were looking at her, that she was setting an example not just as a Rebbitzin, but people were looking at her as to how to be a wife, how to be a mother from a religious Torah perspective. So that commitment, that dedication, that professionalism is one thing that I definitely got. Certainly a warmth and love, an amazing commitment with a beautiful balance of being a companion to my father and a support to him, being an equal and yet being a support. She just got that right. And they both respected each other so very deeply.
How did she push you? So we've heard a few times in your shiur, you talk about your deep learning over the years with your father. What about her?
She didn't push me or us academically. That was my father. She pushed us to have a bit of fun. She pushed us to be normal. She pushed us to...
Naughty sometimes also, Rob? Or just...
Yeah, she loved the naughtiness. My older brother was much naughtier than me, and she loved that in him. So my father was there with the setting the goals and the ambitions and so on. And my mother was completely supportive. They were absolutely on the same page.
Who disciplined, Rob? Who was the disciplinarian? Or both? Or
definitely my father more than my mother. My father, just a look from him was a discipline. You didn't need much more than that. But she was the warmth and the support. And I'll never forget how she used to cry when we went off to yeshiva, because again, going off to yeshiva as young kids, I started off going to yeshiva the first time it was bar mitzvah age.
What year would this be, 1960s, Rob?
This would be, the first time I was there was early 60s. And then during school, I would spend half time in yeshiva and half time in school. She was born in 1913. My father was born in 1912. And they passed away in the 80s. Both died in California. My father died a few years before she did. I just remember her crying when we went off, because we went, again, there was very little communication. Yes, we used to write letters, but it used to take over a week for a letter to get back and forth. You didn't phone. You certainly didn't have email and texting. There was none of that. So when you said goodbye to your child who was going off to learn, that was for a period of, when I was in school, that was for a 6 or 7 month period. And after school, it was for at least a year. We would come home for Yom Tov, and not always. So it was heart-wrenching for her, and she would cry, but be so proud and so happy and so encouraging of us going. So seeing her put our development in Torah before her own emotional needs is something that stayed with me all my life.
You're a young teenager, and you go to a cousin of yours in Gateshead, England, which is a pretty famous yeshiva. Your cousin there has a daily tea at 4 p.m. You got invited, and you got to learn in depth how a Gemara cup, as you said, a Gemara thought process works by analyzing and penetrating a BBC broadcast. Where does a young student find that today? You have a lot of listeners who are some teenagers. I mean, my son's 11, he likes listening, you know? Is that an avenue you could see yourself pursuing, teaching us how to look at current events with Torah lens?
Yeah, so I got that not only from Rabbi Leib Gurvitz, was the Rosh Hashiva of Gateshead, and we used to have this daily tea time appointment, as you mentioned, over tea, as it was called in England. The BBC News would be there. And just by his short, terse comments, we learned the sharpness with which to observe life and notice life and understand life. But I'd been getting that from my father all the years as well. He was obviously, as a leading rabbi, was very involved in current events. He was very involved with the government, with issues around apartheid in South Africa at that time. So the current events was a topic of conversation at the table always. So we started learning it then, and Rabbi Gurvitz just took that to another level. And your question of where does a young person get that today, your question makes me so sad, because it's almost not available today. And it's not just that piece of it. You're touching on something that's so profound, because it's the whole piece of shimush. The Gemara says, "Gadol shimusha yoter milumada." The Gemara says, serving, apprenticing a great scholar is more important than studying from him. Because the studying you'll get eventually, you can study from books, you can study from other scholars, but to create a close relationship with the Talmid Chacham and see him live, and see him integrate his life, and see him be normal, see him laugh, see him respond to things, see him deal with issues. That is such an important part of Torah. It just gives context and breadth and synthesis and balance. And young people can't get that today. Very few have the opportunity to be close. The Torah world is much bigger. When I was in yeshiva, when I was in yeshiva in Israel, we kind of knew everybody who was in yeshiva. There weren't that many people in the, let's say, at least in the non-Hasidic world. I didn't know much about the boys who were learning in the Hasidic world, but in the non-Hasidic world, there were just, you could count them in the hundreds. There were a few big yeshivas, and we used to go for Shabbosim to the different yeshivas. We knew everybody who was learning. It was a small community. Today, it's a massive community, and it's not possible for these masses of young people to get close, intimate with Talmidei Chachomim. I was just so fortunate to be of that generation that still could, and to have had the personal relationships, to have gotten really close with people like Rabbi Gurvitz, the Rosh Hashiva of Gated. He was an Adam Gadol. He was a Gadol already before the war. This was a brilliant Torah scholar in the pre-war era, when he was in the company of the great minds of our times. He was one of those great minds. And his brother-in-law, Rabbi Lapin, I was very, very close to Rabbi Leib. I used to stay in his home, used to eat meals with him and his family, talk about things, ask him things, stayed in contact after the Gateshead period with Rabbi Leib Gurvitz's son, Rabbi Avram Gurvitz, the current Rosh Hashiva of Gateshead. He is an Adam Gadol. He's one of the great people of the Torah world. Again, I lived in his home, learnt with him, spoke to him about ordinary things, asked him advice about ordinary things, got his opinion about what was going on in the world at the moment. What an opportunity. And then later with Rebbe Mishkovsky, my Rosh Hashiva in Kfar Hasidim, we learned Chavrusa every Motzei Shabbos for years. Got close to him as an individual, as a person. Rabbi Lapin, my great uncle, one couldn't get that close to him at the time I got to know him already. He was close to 90. But still, I had Shabbos meals with him. I had an opportunity to see him in action, to be close to him, to take care of him in his older years. I had the great opportunity to spend a few weeks with Rav Moshe Feinstein at very near the end of his life, living in his house and speaking to him and learning from him. That intimacy, that closeness, and many other people, many other just great Torah scholars that I got so close to. I was just so privileged and so fortunate, not only to be close to those great scholars, but most of them, as I mentioned earlier, were already great before the war, or were Talmidim of the greats. My Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Mishkovsky, was a Talmid of Reb Shimon Shkop. Rabbi Leib Gurvitz was a Talmid of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman. These are people who had first-hand Torah from the greats of the previous generation, of the pre-war generation. And I was still of that generation that we could learn from them. After that, it starts getting watered down, so to say. The next generations are so completely different. You're dealing with a completely different caliber of Talmid Chacham, of Gadol b'Yisrael. And there too, just being close to Reb Chaim Shmuelevitz, being able to speak in matters of current issues and shilas with people like Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Elyashiv. As a young rabbi, I had the opportunity to speak to them about the issues that were facing us. These were just opportunities that formed me and made me who I am, and gave me a quality of Torah that I treasure every day, that I learn, and I hope in some small way I'm able to transmit to others.
This might be an uncomfortable question, Rob, but part of this is opening up and being able to see a wide breadth of the Torah world. There's quite a few listeners from many different diverse backgrounds. There are many non-Jews. I've gotten to meet a few non-Jewish listeners in real life. There are listeners from Sephardic background, from Hasidic background, The Rav himself comes from a very prestigious Lithuanian bent. It's a fairly accurate way of putting it. There is a video on GEMS, Jewish Education Media, with your relation with the Lubavitch Rebbe, Chabad. I've personally seen many Sephardim at your shiurim. Can the Rav speak to, Dati L'mi world, non-Orthodox world, the non-religious Jew, conservative reform, and those are tiny units right now. The vast majority are unaffiliated Jews. First of all, where that came from, your ability to speak to these different groups. And second of all, again, back to this young person. How does a young person get that breadth to be able to see also different groups and being able to appreciate the different colors of the rainbow?
So, Benjamin, I think a lot of that is attributed to my parents, to my father, who lived in a very broad world as a rabbi. So his training is in a pure Lithuanian yeshiva. It doesn't get much purer than Telza yeshiva in Telz, Lithuania. Learning in Eitz Chaim with Rabbi Lapin. You don't get more pure, real, intense, unadulterated Torah than that. And now he's a rabbi in South Africa during a period where there are no religious people. When I went to school, my brothers and I were the only young men who wore kippot.
Johannesburg or Cape Town?
This is in Johannesburg,
Okay.
South Africa. So there were other religious people, but none of them really even wore kippot. They were afraid to do that.
And the Rav lived in a Jewish neighborhood, or was?
Yes, it was a Jewish neighborhood, but they weren't religious. So my father's now the rabbi of a traditional community. Everybody is traditional. The shul is full on Friday night. A lot of people come on Shabbos morning before they go to work, and they come and they love his droshes and they love his shiurim and they want to learn from him. So this ability to be able to stay pure in the Torah that you teach. If I think of my father's droshes and how carefully he worked on his sermons to make sure they were all built on Chazal, that these weren't just ideas that he was picking up from somewhere.
Your father wasn't using ChatGPT to write this?
He was not using ChatGPT, and he was, and he didn't have art scrolls and things like that. It was actually extrapolating every thought and idea from Torah using the methodology he was taught in yeshiva. So that ability that he often spoke about and taught us to be totally loyal and faithful to the Torah source, to the text itself, whether the text is a posuk in Chumash, a verse from the Torah, or it's a Rashi, or it's a Medrash, or it's a piece of Gemara, to be absolutely sure that what you're teaching comes from that. This isn't your own idea that you've picked up somewhere. This is coming from the source and coming from the text, and then being able to package it and articulate it in a way that an ordinary person who doesn't have access to that learning can understand, and more than understand, be inspired by. We were trained in that. We had to give a Dvar Torah at the table on Friday nights or on Shabbos. And he critiqued those Divrei Torah. If they weren't inspiring enough, if they weren't exciting enough, if they weren't innovative enough, if they weren't presented in a logical way that was easy to listen to, he would critique that. So we were trained from a very young age to take a Torah idea, develop it, distill it to its essence, and then package it in a way that one could communicate it. And of course, growing up, my elementary school was not a religious school. So I was with kids like that. Then high school was a religious school, but always involved with others and with the broader community and with my father's community. And then the decision to go into the business world means I was engaged and involved with people from across the world, because my work in commodity trading required that I traveled the entire world, all continents, many, many countries, and had to negotiate with people, had to build relationships with people, because in those days, again, you didn't have emails, and you did business by getting close to people, by building trust and relationships with people. So that was an important part of it. And it is something, and you're touching on something that I am very proud of. Thank God that I have been able to communicate to a very broad section of people. And the fact that I try not to label people, the fact that I've come to learn that you can't label people, you don't know what's under the packaging of people. Somebody looks like a Haredi person, but he hardly keeps mitzvot. Somebody looks like a farmer and he has a heart of gold and a deep faith and belief in Hashem, and maybe keeps the mitzvot very, very meticulously. I've just learned that you can't categorize people. You don't know people, and it doesn't matter to me. It's become easier as I've gotten older. As a young person, one tends to try and categorize people, but this is something which has become clear. So when I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi, a Chassid or a Litvish person, a Lithuanian person, it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to access is Torah that is so foundational. I try and teach first principles. I try and teach the Yesodis, not just some little vort, some idea that I've picked up from somewhere, but somewhere where I've spent a lot of time to try and penetrate to the essence so that what I can teach is a first principle. If it's a first principle, it doesn't matter what sect you're from. It doesn't matter what perspective you're from. You'll learn the first principle and you'll apply it in your own life in your own way.
There's a Gemara in Yevamot 79a, which says there are three prominent character traits common to Jews. Jews are modest, compassionate, and act with kindness. This is going to be transitioning out now into early adulthood, transitioning from full-time learning into the business world, and then we're going to go into marriage and parenting education. How do you reconcile the excesses of modern Jewry and Chazal saying that we're modest? If you're going to go around the world right now and ask for the most modest people, the Rav lived in California for many years. There's a follow-up question, I think that comes into it as well, is the Rav mentioned that his parents moved, I'm assuming in their mid-age to late age, to California, not to Israel. And so maybe Rav can elaborate on that. I think it very much plays into this modesty role, because he could have probably very easily moved here, retired, gone to kollel every day, enjoyed himself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the word modesty is not a good translation of that particular Gemara. The Gemara talks about baishonim, the capacity for shame. Modesty is important, and humility, modesty, these are all different words that have different meanings in different contexts. But that particular Gemara you're referring to talks about baishanim. That is a person's ability to feel shame. One of the serious maladies of our time, certainly in the Western world, I think, is people don't feel shame. And a Jew, by definition, in his or her DNA, is that capacity to feel shame. And that drives so much of what we do, particularly self-improvement. So shame is what I feel when I feel I'm not my best. As mentioned earlier, excellence is so important to me, not because I want to show off as being excellent. Excellence is important to me if there's nobody in the room. Excellence is important to me in everything that I do, because I am ashamed of not being my best. I feel shame at not using the gifts that Hashem has given to me. Each of us, I feel shame at not helping others use the gifts that Hashem has given them.
Because the Rav feels that his father's still judging, not in a negative way.
It's not so much as an answering one day, but I see his face. I see my Rebbe's face as well. When I learn something, when I innovate an idea, I say a chidush in the Torah, I see my father's face and I see my Rebbe's face. I see whether they're smiling with pleasure, or they're raising their eyebrows, questioning, or they're looking a little bit, no, come on, that's not, where do you get that from? They react, they respond to me. So there's no question that they're present in my life all the time. And there's no question that there's something of needing to prove myself to them, my father and my Rabbeim, of needing them to be proud of what I'm doing. There's that element as well. But it's become much more innate now, where it's my own desire not to feel shame. So that thing that a Jew feels shame, that's what drives a Jew to greatness and to excellence, because a Jew feels ashamed of not being his or her best. And more than that, a Jew feels ashamed of not making a difference. A Jew feels shame when he or she is a taker and not a giver. When you're a net receiver rather than a net giver. There's a sense of shame in that. It's called nama de kisufo, bread of shame. You're taking handouts. Jews are not victims. We don't want handouts. We want to do it ourselves. We want to create. We want to invest. We want to build. We want to be the philanthropists, not be the beneficiaries of philanthropists. And coming to my father couldn't live without making a difference every day of his life. And his fear about going to Israel, because we spoke about that often, and he was at times offered positions in Israel, but his fear was that he wouldn't be able to make enough of a contribution in Israel. There's so many great people doing such great work in Eretz Israel that he worried that his work would be irrelevant, and he feared irrelevance. And he went to the United States for a number of reasons. There were family issues. My brother was there at the time. There were a lot of reasons as to why they went to California, but the fact that he never went on Aliyah was driven primarily by his belief that he had a job to do where he could make the biggest difference. And that's why he stayed in San Jose, in a relatively small area, which later on became Silicon Valley. At that time, it was in the early days of that, and he pioneered that community rather than going to Los Angeles or New York, where there was already a set community. He would go to Los Angeles every week to teach, to give shiurim. But the main place of investing and building and planting seeds was in this little place, relatively little place, San Jose at the time. So that idea of Baishanim, you talk about Jewish excess and that modesty. So, but if you understand it as Baishanim, it's fine to be a multimillionaire. If you want to be a Paul Reichman and be a tzaddik like he was, who has that midah of busha, It doesn't matter that you're a billionaire. It's irrelevant how much or how little money you've got. It's what kind of character you have. And for some people, all of their effort of investment is in Torah or in their profession. For some, it's in business, and then to be able to use the business, as the case of the Reichmans, to use their money to be able to facilitate unbelievable Torah learning, saving lives, saving families, creating opportunities for people. How many thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people did the Reichmans help with their wealth? So it's not about wealth; it's about character. And we learned that again from our father and from our mother. It's about character, character, character. It's about midot. It's about who you are, not what you do.
We're living in a generation where shame has become a bad word. So if you were to go to most psychologists or therapists or counselors or the myriad of other words that now the professions don't exist, they probably say shame is one of the worst drivers. It's debilitating, not enhancing. The Rav now is saying it's jet fuel for pursuing excellence. And again, in a healthy measure. Can the Rav elaborate on that? And we're going to take that question, Rav, and go into dating and marriage now, because unlike maybe other religions or other philosophies that exist, celibacy is a terrible thing in Judaism. And marriage is one of the great, crucibles of bad character traits. Either sink or swim with it.
So I think you've got to look at shame quite carefully. If you look at shame as I am ashamed of who I am, that's negative and debilitating, and that's the area that the psychology is working with. But they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because there's another part of shame, which is I'm ashamed of who I'm not. Not I'm ashamed of who I am. If I'm ashamed of who I am, that destroys me. If I'm ashamed of who I'm not, that drives me. And the Baishanim, which the Gemara that you quoted talks about as being a quality of Jewishness, is shame at who I could be, shame at who I should be and am not yet. And that drives me to want to be that person, to want to become that person as soon as I possibly can. That is the fuel of spiritual and character ambition.
So the Rav has 5 children. They live in at least 2 continents that I know of, in Israel and North America.
Correct.
How do you meet your wife? How do you know she was the one? What made you decide to become a father? Let's start from the beginning.
So I've been married twice, in both cases to exceptional women in very different ways.
Currently 2 women, Rav? Or
No. I haven't figured out how to do that one yet. So it was consecutive.
Okay.
And I don't really call it a failed marriage. I don't think of it as a failed marriage, because so much good came from it in so many different ways. But certainly there was failure in the sense that it ended in a divorce, and we still have a wonderful connection and relationship. She is an amazing woman from an amazing chain of great people, Talmidei Chachamim, going all the way back to the Mariage and beyond that. An amazing person, an amazing family, not from a religious family. And I met her in my parents' sukkah. She had just lost her father, and she and my parents were befriending. My father had been close to her parents all his life. So the families knew each other, but I never met her until that sukkah. So I was very young. I was 20 years old, I think, when we met. And we got married when I was 23. She was only 19.
Was this love at first sight in the sukkah?
For me it was. I don't know about her, but for me it was.
And then you left, and then similar to your parents, you left.
And then I went back to yeshiva, but in this case there was communication.
Okay,
I have to confess. In this case, there was communication.
For the younger guys listening to this, that's the trick,
Yeah, it was quite funny because the yeshiva in Kfar Chasim was up on the hill, the post office was down in the valley, and the Rosh Yeshiva used to live in the valley. So he would pick up the mail and bring it to the yeshiva, and he would put it in Reb Elia's house. And then there was a guy from the yeshiva that was then responsible to pick up the mail and distribute it. But the mail my Rosh Yeshiva used to pick up the mail, and then it would sit in Reb Elia's house. And my wife, she wasn't yet my wife, of course, at that time, used to very often put little sticky things on the outside of the envelopes, little pictures of owls and all sorts of things, which you can imagine I was quite embarrassed about. But I never really said anything to her. So when I never really know what Rosh Yeshiva thought, but these letters would come, and he would see the little owl on the outside. And so we did write. We were in communication, and we got quite close, because one talks about things sometimes in writing that are much harder to talk about face to face. So through a 3-year courtship that was long distance. Only a few months of it was close. We did get to know one another and had 5 children together.
All in South Africa, Rob?
This was all in South Africa. My son, who's the youngest, was 7 when we left South Africa.
4 daughters.
4 daughters and then a son. 4 wonderful daughters and a wonderful son. Wonderful sons-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So just been very, very blessed in that sense. And then I was alone for many years, over 10 years.
Rob got divorced in South Africa or in...
No, we were in the United States already. When we got divorced, it was quite a long period of separation before we could really decide that we really want to go ahead with divorce. Eventually, that's what we did. And then I was alone for many years. And I was on a trip to South Africa, and 2 of my students, 2 of my Talmudim in South Africa, met Amber, who's my current wife. She was working for the community in Port Elizabeth. They went down on community business. She was assigned to take care of them. And they just said to each other, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" And they said, yes. They both knew what the other was thinking, and they were thinking, this is somebody we've got to introduce to me. A very unlikely shidduch, a very unlikely marriage.
Rob, were you more Dove or more David when you were dating Amber? What was the style?
You should ask her that question.
Okay, we'll ask her afterwards.
Not sure. Great question. Not sure, but of both probably. I say not a likely one because she was a convert. She had been married to a Jewish man. She converted before she married the Jewish man, but she'd also been married prior to that to a non-Jewish man. So she has some non-Jewish children. She has a Jewish daughter as well. But she's just an exceptional woman in so many different ways. And perhaps most of all, she has the ability to create an oasis of tranquility no matter where. So whether we're somewhere in the jungle or we're here in Israel with a war going on around us, she just creates tranquility not only in aesthetics, but just in atmosphere. And I think at this stage of my life, I felt I have a lot of excitement through the learning and the teaching and the business engagement and travel. I didn't need the excitement anymore. What I needed, I think, was that opportunity to find peace and tranquility and love in a much more quiet way. And that's what she is brilliant at. And I'm deeply indebted to her for that.
Any stories behind the name of your children?
They all have a bit of a story. But my oldest daughter, Ashira, we did not know what to name her. For some reason, I don't even know why.
No 160th in Nevuah when she first came out? It was
just that we weren't sure at all. And I went to shul to name her, and I didn't know yet. We hadn't agreed what to name her. And I'm called up to the Torah for the shiur. It was Shabbos shiur before Pesach. And as the shiur is being read, I just say to myself, Ashira. Her name is Ashira.
And she drew this behind, she's the one who drew this?
And she's the one who drew this picture of my father. So Ashira, her second name is Liba, which is the wife of Rabbi Lapin. We spoke about, who I used to have tea with every day in Gateshead. Auntie Liba was just this wonderful, wonderful woman. So her name is Ashira Liba. The second girl was going to be a boy. I knew it for sure she was going to be a boy. I had no doubt that she was going to be a boy. And she was born just after Rabbi Lapin passed away. So I was going to call him Labe. But she wasn't a boy. She switched genders. And she came out a beautiful, wonderful, loving, amazing girl. And so we called her Livia, which is a lioness. And she was born in Elul, so we called her second name was Dina, like from Yom HaDin. The third daughter was born, and as she was born, I took a look at her. She gave me a stare, a perceptive, insightful stare. And I said to my wife, "Do you notice anything about this girl?" She said, "Just look at that stare." And I thought, this is a Bruria. This is a Bruria. She knows stuff. She's questioning. She's challenging. And so we called her Bruria and Leah after my grandmother. And then came Chedva, who was just such an obvious, joyous little girl. And again, at the moment of birth, I just looked at her and thought, Chedva, we called her Freda after my other grandmother. Freda in Yiddish is the Yiddish for joy. So she's Chedva Freda. And Moshe also, we weren't sure what we were going to call him. And then we thought Moshe, after Moshe Feinstein, who had just died, and also Moshe Tukachinsky from Slobodka. I was very close to him. So we were both, my wife and I were very close to Rav Moshe Tukachinsky. So there were 2 Moshes who'd just passed away. So we thought our son would be Moshe. And our shul had just bought a Sefer Torah, and before Moshe was born. And I was writing the last word of the Sefer Torah, Yisrael. And as I was writing the word, I thought, that's his second name. So he is Moshe Yisrael.
To go into the educational choices for your kids, you said on a podcast recently that if you were to start up your own school or educational system, you would teach three things: Gemara, mathematics, and English. Mathematics is the language of technology. English, it's the language of communication. For parents of younger children who are listening, what big question about chinuch should we be asking that no one is talking about?
So if you're not going to do it that way, just teach them three subjects, but you're going to send them to a conventional school. And I think the big issue is, what is the product of the school? I think we look at the school and we look at the curriculum of the school and we look at the all sorts of things, the facilities that the school has to offer. Just look at the products. You need to go into an 11th or 12th grade class and see the children and see, do you want your child to come out something like that? Because the environment is going to help form that child. As much as we like to think that we do the formulation of the child in our homes, and hopefully a lot of it does come from our homes, but a lot of it is going to come from the school. So you want to look at the products, not only the 11th and 12th graders, but you want to look at young people who are alumni of that school. And just see, and what you want to look at is, number one, midot. What is their character? Do they have midot? That's the one thing that you can't learn later. You've got to learn as a young child. And do they have a sense of curiosity? Because if a child has curiosity, they'll learn whatever they need to. Do they have drive? Do they have a sense of urgency? I have a client who's the CEO of a very, very large banking organization, and he said to me he only hires for two qualities: urgency and care. I want people to have a sense of urgency. They're going to get that idea of busha. I feel ashamed at who I'm not. I want to be better. I want to do more for the world. You want your child to have some of that drive, and you want the child to be caring. You want the child to have midot. And if you can look at an education for your child that doesn't quell that at least doesn't destroy that. Because children have those things naturally. Children naturally have a sense of urgency. They naturally have a sense of shame of who they're not, and that drives their ambition. And they naturally have a sense of caring. You don't want a schooling system that quells that destroys that. And if you can find a school that develops that, so how much better would that be? Everything else they can learn later, they can pick up later. But empathy, caring, chesed, that they need to learn very young. And drive, that sense of wanting to make a difference, of fulfilling their purpose in the world, you want them to learn that very young.
Speaking of chesed, kindness, what do you think is the kindest thing you've done in your marriage? And what do you think is one of the kindest things that Amber's done for you?
Well, again, I think you've got to ask her about what the kindest thing that I've done, because I think that's very much in the recipient's mind. Yes, we can do chesed, but what we think is chesed is not always a chesed, and vice versa. If there's a person dying of thirst and hunger on a desert island, and I take all the money that I've got and I buy a diamond, and I give that person the diamond, he's on a desert island, there's not another person there, and I say, here's all the money and wealth I've got is in this diamond, I'm giving it to you, buy, and off I sail. That's not chesed. It's been enormous sacrifice for me, but it's no chesed. If I bring him a loaf of bread and a flask of water, that's much more chesed. So we've got to judge chesed by the recipient, by what it means to the recipient, not the giver. And so it's very hard for me to say what is the chesed that I've done for my wife, because I'm sure my answers would be very different. I might think of big things that I've done for her, and she might think of little things that have made the difference. I think the biggest chesed she's done for me has been the acceptance and love of my family, of my children, of my whole family, the dignity and honor with which she treats my former wife, the love and affection and adoration and admiration that she has for all of my children, and a connection with my grandchildren. I think that's been, for me, one of the very great chasodim that she's done for me.
The next few pieces we're going to have now are going to be about your rabbinical journey and then Matmonim. You mentioned in a shiur recently that one of your original attendees of your Johannesburg, who now lives in Ramat Beit Shemesh, how do you keep in touch with Talmidim? And same question, how do you recommend Talmidim keep in touch with you?
So Benjamin, that's a sadness in my life, that I don't keep in touch enough. And I get very excited when there is a connection. And we'll talk about those connections in a moment. I don't keep in touch enough because of, it's not only time. And I hope that some of my Talmidim are listening to this. I have an ever-present love for each of you. You're in my mind, you're in my heart. People that I haven't seen for 30 years. I'm very, very conscious of you and very aware of you. It's not just a question of time shortage, it's also mind space shortage. Sometimes I feel my life is just so full, which is a brocha, it's an enormous brocha, but also it's a burden to carry that sometimes even my own children and grandchildren feel. And it pains me enormously that they don't feel enough presence from me. And I know that a lot of my Talmudim don't feel that presence, and it's really hard for me. I'm also not an extrovert, I'm an introverted person. So it's hard for me to project presence, especially when I'm not physically present in their lives and them in my lives. And I wish there was more connection. And they keep in touch with me by sending me texts, by sometimes calling me. Sometimes I'll hear from somebody that I haven't heard from for many, many years. And sometimes it'll be somebody more familiar. The Talmudim who I know are listening to the Matmonim virtually every day and will send me a comment or a question or a cutting from a news item.
Do you read all the comments? Like, let's say I leave something on one of the YouTube or Spotify. Do you get comments? And
I occasionally go through. I think Thea, our YouTube manager, takes away some of the comments that are not worth keeping. A lot of them I don't see. I do see some of the negative ones. I try to go through them. I don't say that I see everyone, but you can't really communicate on YouTube.
Email? I mean, how would you recommend best?
The best is through email or texting. Definitely would be the way. And even if it's just a short, I'm listening, I'm loving it, or a question or a critique, whatever it is, I love to receive it. I'm not always, I try and respond quickly and to everybody. Occasionally something falls through and I don't. It's not because of it not being important to me. It's just because of time and life being so packed.
Who do you go for Eitzah, mentoring, guidance, or course trajectory adjustment at this point in your life? They're all 75. And, there are many, many Rabbanim significantly older than you, 20, 30 years older than you. Who are you going to now?
It's a good question, and it's a hard question because I don't have close connections with people.
Your brother? Who do you go?
Yes, I'll talk to my brother. I find my son is a confidant. My daughters as well, but my son is an amazing confidant and has enormous wisdom. So I will exchange ideas and explore ideas and look at options with them. But in terms of Rabbeim, my Rabbeim have all passed on. The people who are currently Gedolei Yisrael, I don't have a close and intimate relationship with. I wish I did, and maybe need to put some more effort at this stage to create some new connections and relationships so as to be able to have those conversations. So a lot of it I have in, I don't know how to say this without being weird, but almost like in ongoing conversations with my Rabbeim. I communicate with my father and with my Rabbeim, and they do with me. So I do get guidance, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's just by a look on their face. I do get guidance. I spoke to you this morning offline about communication that I got from my Rebbe Reb Chaim Shmulevitz just 2 weeks ago, just through something I coincidentally happened to be learning. It was a piece that my son selected randomly, but every word on that page was talking to me and solving the dilemma for which I had been mispalel. I davened to Hashem and said, these are two options I have. I don't know which to take. They're equally weighted. I don't know which to take. And there, through the piece of learning of something that Reb Chaim Shmulevitz had written so many years before, I got such direct communication. So that keeps me going. But definitely it would be so valuable to have connections with Gedolei Yisrael of today.
You woke up one morning and you decided to start Matmonim. Why? What's the purpose? If we were to clip this next piece and send it out, a friend wants to say, you got to listen to this shiur. One liner. They have 10 seconds of today's extreme attention deficit disorder. Why spend 20 minutes with you learning the daf?
Without sounding arrogant, because there are lots of wonderful shiurim available on the daf and on other things, lots and lots, and they really are good. But what is Matmonim? Is because when you listen to Matmonim, you'll see what you missed. You'll see what you didn't see. And you'll realize how much you're missing. Just to understand the depth and wonder and relevance and urgency and power of every daf of Gemara, and we rush through it. People learning daf yomi, right, go through a daf in an hour or less. It's not possible to really see the wonders of the daf. You get a little glimpse here and a little glimpse there. So I started Matmonim as not a counter movement, because daf yomi is an amazing movement. It's a social movement. It's a learning movement. It's incredible in what it's done for the Jewish people and what it does for the Jewish people. But the downside with the daf yomi is people, when they do the daf, think they're learning Torah. And they're not learning Torah, they're reading, they're listening. There's a passivity. And what I wanted to do was, in this period of attention deficit that you're talking about, is there a way in 15 or 20 minutes to give people an insight as to what's there, so that, number one, they get take-home value right there and then, that from that 15 or 20 minutes, they get a principle that they can apply in their lives immediately. Number two, they realize how much depth and relevance there is in the Talmud, and they build greater kavod Torah, they build greater honor for the Torah, understanding the wonders of the Torah and the privilege that we have access to the Torah, that Hashem gave us the Torah. So to be able to get that, and then to give people method, so that people who are consistently learning the Matmonim, preferably using the source sheet as well, are learning how to do it themselves, how to take an idea and extrapolate it, and cook the idea up until the matmon, the hidden treasure, kind of percolates to the surface. And out of all that learning comes an aha moment when you say, oh my goodness, just look at this. Look what's come out of this. That's what I'm trying to expose, that which cannot be achieved in a daf yomi shiur, where you have to move at such a pace.
Rabbi, final thoughts and reflections. There's two parts to this question. One, if you had to meet anyone in history, I'm saying having lunch, having a social, private, one-on-one interaction. And then two, it's connected to this, who would you meet? If you were to go back to the very first question, which was, how do you want your Talmud to describe you 4 years from now? And now you're meeting that person that you want to meet again. It could be your father, it could be Moshe Rabbeinu, it could be anybody, it could be John Lennon. I don't know, anyone the Rav wants, right? How do you want that person to describe you 4 years from now?
So people I would love, just off the top of my head, I'm sure if I thought about it longer, there might be different people that come to mind, but I think I would want to meet the Rambam. There's some delightful, wonderful people, of course, but I meet them every day, kind of. The Rambam, I don't really meet, because to really understand, if I do learn a piece of Tosfos read and I spend enough time of it, as we saw yesterday or today, understanding a Rashbam, I see their brilliance. It comes out. I feel we've had an interaction, we've learned together. At the Rambam, the brilliance is in kind of the whole overview. It's in the system. It's in the everything. I don't learn a Rambam and feel the Rambam and I are buddies, that we've had a chavrusa together. I just look at it and I think, oh my goodness, this is just so beyond. So I don't know what I would say to the Rambam. Maybe nothing. Maybe just see him and hear him and just be in his presence. But the Rambam is somebody I would want to see. And the Vilna Gaon, I think, again, I don't think I would be able to have a conversation with the Vilna Gaon. I don't know if anybody today could actually have a conversation with him, but I wouldn't need to have a conversation with him. I would just want to sit in his presence and see him, if I could. And what would I want people like that to say about me? When I went to Lithuania, I had a moment twice. One was at the kever of the Vilna Gaon, at the Vilna Gaon's grave, and one was at the grave of Reb Shimon Shkop, my Rebbe's Rebbe. And in both of those cases, I had a sense of, I'm going to take your Torah and make it relevant to people in our generation. Not just teach it as you taught it to your generation, because that was fit for them. It might not be fit. I'm going to try and be a vehicle that enables your Torah to penetrate the consciousness of people today. And I've tried to do that sometimes in teaching the Biur HaGra, the Vilna Gaon itself, when there's an opportunity to do so, or certainly using his methodology, and certainly the same with Reb Shimon Shkop. So I would want them to say, thank you for what you did in your generation, that you operated as an interface between our Torah, which was too intense for your generation, and you were able to package it in a way that they could grasp it, and thereby extend our reach into your time, into your generation.
I'd like to thank the Rav for the time and getting in a little more in depth as to where the Rav's coming from, origin stories, I think the next conversation, if we merit to have one of these, is we're going to go in depth onto the business side and also some of the rabbinic side. But I think this is a pretty great place to stop right now and give a teaser for the next one. So if we have quite a few views on this one and some comments and maybe some emails to the Rav, we'll do this again. I just want to finish off on a deeply personal note that you've radically enhanced my Torah learning this last year. It's been over a year now that I first listened to Matmonim. It came up in the Google algorithm. It was incredibly powerful and moving, not just myself. My wife listens every day. She doesn't understand any of the Gemaras at all or who these people are, but now she's starting to quote, again, yesterday was so Rid, there's this, rabbi who lived, a few hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago, and he was on gondolas, it's tremendously enhanced Torah in my home. And I'm sure there's thousands of other listeners throughout the world. And I'd like to deeply appreciate the sacrifice. I know you're up very early. And again, on behalf of listeners, it means the world to us. And we look forward to many years of long health and lots of strength to continue.
Thank you, Benjamin.